Last night the caldera lay like a sleeping ear, listening to its own heat, and I worked the rim the way we always do when the weather has stopped arguing. The wind fell to a low hiss along the pumice, and the snow that had clung in shadow was crusted thin and mean. I moved station to station with a practiced gait, boots reading the slope, shoulders remembering the weight of the pack. I carry the same tools each time because routine is a kind of armor, the seismometer in its hard case, the gas sensor wrapped like a pet that hates the cold, the rock hammer scuffed to a dull shine, the drone folded small, the thermal camera ready to tell me where warmth collects in ways the eye edits out. My hands know the sequence. Open the case, seat the geophone, test the line, log the orientation. Mark the time in words, not digits, because I have learned to speak to my future self as if he were tired and needed kindness. The first station sat on a ledge of welded ash that had cooled into something like dark bread. I brushed off grit, drove the spike until it sang a brief answer, and let the instrument settle. The little screen pulsed with its comfort noise, the Earth's whisper of its own posture, and I let it run while I breathed through my scarf and watched the crater steam. There was no weather trick to blame for the stillness, no distant storm feeding ghosts into the trace. I felt the ground with gloved fingers, palm flat as if it were a forehead, and told the recorder that conditions were plain. It is good to say simple things aloud before a night gets ideas. I walked the arc we had plotted weeks ago, the route that lets one person set and check a handful of ears before the cold takes toes and judgment. At each stop, I repeated the dance. Place, test, log, listen, move. The drone I kept leashed to anticipation. Batteries do not love dark cold, and rotors make a sound the crater learns too quickly. I kept it folded because the air did not ask for eyes, only patience. The thermal camera did get its turn. I swept it across the inner wall and the far talus, and the screen offered a soft quilt of ordinary heat, vents breathing in thin threads, a boulder with a warm memory on its sunward face, nothing that would make a person swear softly into a scarf. The first odd note came like a polite throat clear. The seismometer, settled well and singing its fine flat line, lifted a hair before my boot heel found the ground again. A tiny rise ahead of my footfall, not the echo of it. I froze with the foolish grace of prey. I waited, counted my breaths the way one counts slow in the head, and the line dulled to its ordinary squirm. I told the recorder that a pre-step twitch had shown and that I would watch for rhythm. Then I put my foot down. The Earth did not answer late or early. It did not answer at all. Only the instrument had spoken, and it had done so before it had a reason. I wrote it as a curiosity and tried to feel like a professional who treats such things as burps in wire or mood in sand. I gave the gas sensor a job because work steadies the mind. The rim's plume had been faint all day, just a suggestion of sulfide when the air sank into the bowl. And at this hour, even that had thinned. I lifted the intake toward the steam like a priest offering a bell and waited for the little pump to calm. The graph, if I had let myself see it that way, would have shown a line too clean for hope. The readout by feel and habit told me there was less than the nose would claim. My scarf carried a ghost of rotten egg, where the instrument swore up and down that the air tasted almost plain. I walked a short arc to rule out a pocket, and the sensor stayed polite while my nose insisted on a story. I logged that the instrument and the body were at odds and would argue later with a longer sample. I did not say into the recorder that I have learned which of the two is more likely to lie. The second odd note was the way the map shifted under my boots. Our flags were old friends. We set them in a gentle chain that made sense to tired legs. None of them had mines. But in the dark, with the headlamp throwing its narrow proof on rock and scrub and wind-scoured snow, two of the flags seemed to have traded manners. The one that should have leaned into the bowl stood upright as if braced by invisible hand, and the one that should have stood straight affected a lean. I told myself wind eddies and drift and small slides of ash can make a person narrate movement where there is none. I moved on and pretended I believed it. Below the northern lip, the ground grows young again, fresh fractures, stones that still clack like broken plates. I set another sensor there, nursing the cable into a shallow trench so boots wouldn't tug it later. The seismometer settled as if happy with that bed. I backed away slowly, boot quiet, expecting the little lift before a step. It did not come in that same way. Instead, a short series of hesitations ran through the line as if the ground were thinking about a move and then reconsidered. The body has its own meter, and mine stepped in time to the thought. If it had been a creature in brush, I would have said it tested the air and withdrew. If it had been ice, I would have called it a shift that never made up its mind. With rock, I do not use those words easily, but I could not find better. I took the drone out then because my patience had begun to thin and I wanted a quick look at the basin floor without climbing the last shaly pitch. I kept the flight below the height of my raised hand and sent it crawling along the rim like a beetle with a single eye. The camera sent back gray and softer gray, a heat signature picking out a few exhalations where the basin kept its own counsel. The feed stuttered, a hiccup I blamed on cold, numb plastic, and for a blink, the grid overlay smeared then reassembled with the crosshair nudged a finger's width from where I knew I had left it. I corrected and told myself not to chase ghosts through lenses. When I brought the drone home, it hummed like a tired mouth against my glove, and I felt a faint static that raised the hair on the back of my wrist. Dry air, yes, also the way a monitor leans towards you in a dark room when no one is touching it. I let the thermal camera take another slow sip of the basin while I watched our camp lights far off below the shoulder. The camera showed me what any patient tool would, the rim cooler than the bowl, the vents a little brighter than their skin, a smear of warmth that traveled a small distance along scree and then thinned as though a living heat had passed and lost its right to stay. I traced that path with my finger on the screen and felt foolish because I knew there was no creature to follow, and yet my finger insisted on the path. I told the recorder that a transient line of warmth not tied to wind or runoff had appeared. I said it twice because later I would want to hear the reluctance in my voice. I checked the gas again at the same spot where the nose and the instrument had disagreed. The air now smelled less like a match left in rain and more like old wire. The sensor read the same flat humility. I tapped the housing, listened to the pump, watched the indicator breathe in its quiet way, and held the intake near the ground. The reading stayed stubbornly ordinary. I said into the log that I would pull a manual sample for lab work, and that in the field the instrument found no change while the operator did. It is a dangerous sentence. It asks a person to decide later whether the mind was hunting patterns in dark or the machine had been taught to ignore what we do not wish to report. The last check brought me back to the first station. The line played its low winter music, and the case clicked faintly as the temperature dropped. I stood over it and waited without shifting my weight, wanting to see whether the anticipatory twitch was a one-off trick. The instrument behaved, patient and dull. I flexed the foot I would use first. The thought came again across the trace, a small lift before the body had made its choice. I kept my heel raised and watched the line hold its breath. The ground under me felt like a beast settling its ribs. I put my heel down only when the trace went flat again, and the feeling called calm. No wave followed. The earth had anticipated a weight that had not arrived and then pretended it had never done so. On the walk back along the rim, I kept my light tight and low, eyes in the edge of the beam where movement often hides. The wind never rose above a whisper. The snow's crust broke in small agreements. Our flags kept their roles except for the two that did not. On the radio, I heard camp in the soft voices tired people use when they wish not to wake something sleeping beside them. I answered with the bare minimum, a report without color, and kept the rest in the recorder where I could argue with myself in daylight. The sky above the caldera wore a thin skin of cloud that made the stars waver as if looking through water, and I told the night I would return at first light to repeat every step. At the tent, I laid the rock hammer by the door the way I always do, iron against fabric, a kind of old promise. I set the seismometer logs by the stove and cupped my hands around the heat. The gas sample vial lay on the table like a small refusal. The drone's props ticked as they shed cold. I played back a short stretch from the recorder and listened to my own voice say that the ground had moved ahead of my body by a breath, and that the air had said match while the instrument said snow. I stopped the tape and stood with my ear bent to the canvas. The crater's breath is something you can hear from the rim if you are quiet and unlucky. From the tent, I heard only fabric testing its patience. Still, I found myself counting the gaps between those soft adjustments as if waiting for a missed beat. No alarms, no clear breach of the order that keeps foolishness from turning to harm. Only small disagreements noted in neat handwriting. The map will settle in the morning, I told myself. The instruments will apologize without words the way they do when cable seat and frost lets go. That is the way it should be. I slept in short slices anyway, and each time I woke I felt the ground answer a step I had not yet taken. At first light, the crater wore a pale gauze that softened edges without hiding them, and the air pressed cool and honest against the teeth. I told the recorder that I was repeating the circuit with special attention to the place where the line had anticipated a step, and to the question of gas where the nose says one thing and the sensor says another, routine first. I warmed the pump inside my jacket while the stove gave the tent a temper that made hands obedient. The drone stayed folded. I would not start the day with a guess through glass. The hammer rode the pack where I could feel its weight at the hip, a small anchor on a morning that might try to lift me into speculation. I walked out with the scarf dry and the headlamp off, trusting the weak glow to keep me sober. The rim keeps its own schedule. If you know it well, you can feel the body find the slope before the eyes arrange their map. My boots took the old shallow path to the first station, the one set on welded ash that always keeps its promise. The seismometer case bore a skin of rime, not enough to bind. I brushed the lid with a mittened hand, listened for the stop of hinges, and woke the trace. Comfort noise came like slow rain on tin. I crouched and kept still, letting the line show me whether it remembered the small, pre-step flirt from last night. The instrument hummed its uncaring lullaby. I drew a breath, lifted my heel, and felt the oddness like the memory of a dream returning only when you stand in the kitchen and touch a familiar cup. The lift came a heartbeat before my weight shifted, tiny and unmistakable in the thin doorway between thoughts, anticipation as quiet as a blink. I set the heel again without moving forward, and the lift fell back into the flatland. The instrument behaved normally when I acted and predicted when I prepared. I told the recorder that the phenomenon persisted. I did not give it any names. The wind brought a new flavor and left an old one. The plume in the bowl breathed thin. My nose found a faint match head and a whiff of heated metal, the sort of smell a transformer leaks when a storm passes in city air, which is a strange thought to have on a high rim where the only wires are in your own kit. The gas sensor, warmed well and primed by habit, played the same calm song as the night before. Its intake drank and declared almost nothing. I walked a slow arc along the breeze, pausing where the steam ran thin and at a point along the slope that carried no visible exhalation. The pump kept its even tiny heartbeat, and the reed stayed humble. I pressed the intake close to the ground where warmth can hug stone, then held it at chest height where eddies gather stories. No change the instrument would deign to print. I told the recorder that the discrepancy between body and device had increased. My tongue tasted metal I did not have in my mouth. I pulled another sample into glass because sometimes the proof you need is the one that hums later in a lab and laughs at the field. The flags had not forgotten their odd roles. The pair that had switched their manners continued the charade, one upright without respect for the bowl's tug, one leaning as if listening. I inspected their bases, finding no fresh slide marks, no new small avalanches of ash, only prints that belonged to my own boots and to fox pads that had come in the dark and gone toward lower safety. On the map in my hand, folded and sweat-soft, the line of flags made the same lazy curve we laid out in early season. On the ground, the space between two of them felt stretched, as if the walk had become longer without gaining distance. I counted paces in the quiet way you count in your head with words instead of numbers, and found myself short by a step when I reached the second. It is an old trick of terrain to steal strides, but it is not a trick of poles jammed in ash and snow to do so without moving. I told the recorder that spatial drift was suggested and that I would not dignify the suggestion until I had looped the circuit twice. At the second station, I nursed the cable, examined the spike, and listened with my palm. The ground felt like a living thing, practicing a breath it had not yet chosen to take. The trace remained polite until I thought about lifting my foot, then offered its small bow. I lowered the heel and the line pretended innocence. I spoke into the recorder the sentence I did not want to speak, correlation with intent observed. If I were writing a paper, I would use other words in a longer argument, and I would invite colleagues to tell me where I had fooled myself. Here I had only the morning and the thin cloud and the small heat of the plume to keep me honest. I gave the thermal camera its turn. I swept it across the inner wall and basin, letting the scene settle before moving, because rush makes patterns that do not exist. Ordinary features appeared in their familiar palette: vents warm and shy, a boulder whose belly kept night's gift, a lazy ribbon where runoff had carried yesterday's sun. Then again, the thing that makes caution lean forward. A smear of warmth, narrow at first, sliding from a talus tongue along the basin floor, not in the direction the wind would choose, and not aligned with slope or channel. A path drawn by a body with agency rather than by water or air. I held the frame and let the camera drink until any artifact would be tired of pretending. The smear moved with the patience of a slow animal, yes, but also with the stutter of a trick of light. I told the recorder that a transient warm line was present, direction weakly downslope, then cross-grain, fading where no shade would keep it. I didn't follow it down. The day has rules because those who break them come back changed or do not come back. I called camp on the radio to note my position in human words. The reply came with a fold in it, a small lag as if a hand had gone over the wire and pressed without meaning to. The voice that answered belonged to a colleague I know as well as any, but the cadence rode a half step behind the meaning. I asked them to repeat, and the second time the words aligned with their rhythm. We blamed the hills, we always do. I logged it anyway because delay is a cousin of anticipation. I returned to the gas question because the morning had been built around it. I set the sensor at the rim with the intake secured against a small stake to remove my hand from the ritual. The pump worked and the device breathes better when it forgets the warmth of a person. I left it to draw and walked a short loop to the station where the anticipation had felt strongest. I pretended to be a passerby and not an observer. I let my body think about stepping near the sensor without committing. The seismometer offered its tiny bow even at that distance, less sure, but still in advance of a choice. When I collected the gas sensor, the log reported the same clean air it had reported when I held it, a near emptiness that did not match the nose or the thin sting in the eyes brought by the new breeze. I told the recorder that both methods disagreed with the body and that I would pursue a third. I climbed to a small notch where the rim funnels breath and held a plain paper strip in the wind. The strip took on a faint discoloration that in a lab would be a number, and in the field is only a color that leans. It was enough to keep doubt honest. I walked the rest of the circuit and let the work fill the space where fear likes to live. Spike checks, cable seats, a quick swing of the hammer to test a slab for hollowness. The drone remained patient in its case. The thermal camera marked another soft path, weaker now, moving in and out of stones as if it respected some law I did not know. At the far lip, I stood where you can see the sea if the air is sharp. The horizon lay ironed and flat, the clouds above it bent into a thin line as if drawn by a ruler on damp paper. The smell shifted again. Less match head, more old wiring. And then, for a handful of breaths, nothing. The air went blank. The sensor, when I raised it on reflex, took that moment to chirp a false alarm that died as fast as it came. I said into the recorder that the device had hesitated, that the body had sensed a pocket of absence rather than excess, and that both together make a kind of message no manual has a page for. On the return to camp, I stopped at the two flags that had shown their little rebellion. I took them up and pressed them back in the posture the map wanted, leaning the one that had stood proud and righting the one that had listened too hard to the basin. I stepped away, turned my back, spoke a short checklist to the recorder, and turned again. The flags had not moved. I had not expected them to. Still, when I walked the distance between them, the ground took a stride from me, the way a friend steals a bite and laughs, except there was no laughter. Only the soft rush of steam below and the quiet complaint of pumice under boot. I bent, touched the ash at my toe, and felt a tremor so shy it could have been my own pulse answering my finger. Back inside the tent, I set the vials in a line beside the stove and steadied my breathing. The logs lay open where I could look at my own handwriting and decide whether I believed the person who had written it. The drone came out at last, and I ran the props without lift, listening for the way a motor tells you its mood. The tone settled into a smooth hum, and then, with no command from me, it touched a higher note and fell back as if the air in the tent had thickened for a moment, and then thinned. I told myself batteries, temperature, trivial drift. I said it again out loud to give the lie some weight. Outside, the crater exhaled in a rhythm too slow to be a comfort and too steady to be ignored. I laid the rock hammer back by the door and told the recorder that the day remained routine on paper and wrong in the gut, and that I would keep the alarm armed but not loud. Someone once taught me that patience is a tool. Tonight it would also be a test. Fog is the rim's second language. It came in without drama, a soft spill over the far wall that turned edges into rumors and held the plume inside a pale bowl. I told the recorder that I was resuming the loop with a focus on visibility effects, and that my aim was to give the place fewer excuses for mischief by tightening every habit. Stove, gloves, pump warm under the jacket, hammer where my hand could find it without looking, drone still folded, thermal camera slung high to keep its lens dry. I stepped out and felt the ash under snow go from crisp to felted in the span of a breath, the way a road does when rain finally commits. The air tasted like old wire again. I put words to that taste into the log because repetition trains you to separate weather from message. From camp to rim, I counted in the soft way that dodges digits, a cadence of steps learned from seasons on hostile slopes. The fog took depth first and then color. Flags I had set right the day before presented themselves as if they had been born that way, and yet the space between them felt stretched in the same sly manner. I stopped at the first station and cleared the case with a mittened swipe. The hinge protested, then gave, and the trace woke into its low, rain-on-tin comfort. I did not move my feet. I waited for my body to think about moving. The lift came before the thought had fully formed, a little nod in the line that said the ground knew a step was coming, even when I told myself I would stand still. I lowered my heel to be sure it read my intention, and the line smoothed at once. I told the recorder that anticipatory response persisted under low visibility and that fog did not scramble the effect. The gas question had not forgiven me. I set the warmed sensor to drink on its own stake, then walked a small circle to sniff the air where the plume thinned into breath. My nose found the same braid of match and metal with a sourness like wet car battery that does not belong to this place. The sensor stayed polite, its little heartbeat steady, its output the kind of clean line that makes grant committees happy and field workers uneasy. I pulled a strip of reactive paper from the pocket where I keep it for arguments with instruments, and I held it in the drift. The paper leaned toward a faint stain, not the showy change that chases headlines, only the kind that forces you to say into a recorder that you have seen something you will not be able to reproduce on command. I heard myself speaking in the careful tone I reserve for the moments when I fear I am adding color where there is none. I ended the clip with the words, "Maintain skepticism, expand sampling." I gave the thermal camera its turn because fog makes liars of eyes and honest witnesses of sensors, and then sometimes does the reverse. The screen grew a matte texture from the moisture in the air, and I wiped it with the clean corner of my scarf before panning along the inner wall. Warm threads showed themselves through the haze like veins under thin skin. The bowl floor carried a dim patchwork, ordinary by this place's standards. Then a path appeared and began to slide. Not bright, not hungry, just a warmer line than its neighbors that moved against the habit of wind and the tilt of debris. It threaded stones and faded, then returned one stone away, as if shadowing a route that was not on the surface. I held the frame until my arms complained so I would not accuse Hurry of inventing the thing. The smear remained. I said into the log that a mobile warm signature traveled cross-grain and in brief disappearances, and that I would not pursue it down. I meant it when I said it. Even so, my feet leaned toward the slope. Fog changes sound before it changes sight. The crater's breath became a slow hush that swallowed my own steps and gave them back a beat late. I called camp on the radio, short and dull, position, status, intent to complete the circuit and return. The reply climbed out of static with a slight wobble in cadence, the same fold as before, as if syntax had put on a new jacket and was trying to find the pockets. I asked for confirmation of their last phrase. The second time it came clean. We blamed moisture in the line and the bends between us, but I logged that a delay and correction had repeated. Delay has cousins. Anticipation is one. Misalignment is another. The flags on the north arc stood where I had ordered them, but the way between them played long again. I attempted a crude measure by voice, a quiet count of strides paced against the memory of yesterday's loop. When I reached the second pole, my mouth had run past the word I had expected, and that is a kind of metric, even if it would embarrass an auditor. I needed a handful of ash and felt a tremor too soft to call a tremor if your mind is not already sharpened to it. I held my palm over the ground with the caution of a person smelling a pot lid before lifting it. The heat there was not enough to speak its own name, and yet the skin learned something beyond air temperature. I told the recorder that spatial drift continued to present, and that tactile readings suggested an underskin pulse inconsistent with visible venting. At the third station, the seismometer greeted me with the flat patience of a patient that wishes to be told it is improving. I reseated the spike, tightened the line, and listened with my eyes shut, because sometimes taking away sight tells the body what it has been lying about. The line hummed in the low way again, then gave the small early nod when the thought of movement crossed the mind. I held the thought without moving, fed it a little, and the trace answered again, as if the ground had tuned itself to the question rather than to the action. I said into the recorder that the response scaled with intent, which is a sentence I would prefer not to hear with my own name attached. The fog beaded on my lashes. The air went blank for a handful of breaths, taste and smell both removed, and in that short absence the instrument hiccuped and settled, the small false alarm I had heard the day before, now wearing new clothes. I took the drone out because the fog had made the world small and I needed a high eye, even if the height was laughable. I kept it low and near, just far enough to lift above the rim and find the basin floor's shape. The feed rolled in shades of damp wool. The overlay grid flickered and rebuilt with a twitch that nudged the crosshair, a cousin to the smear from yesterday. I corrected and held that correction, then let the craft hover with its props whispering. A soft static gathered in the skin of my wrist where the controller rested, a field barely there, like the breath of a cat through a sleeve. The drone drifted a finger's width without input, then corrected itself, the way a tired person nods and wakes. I pulled it back and landed, telling the log that an uncommanded microdrift occurred and that control returned without input. Moisture can do such things. So can stories told by fields we do not map. When the fog thickened to the kind that makes each step an argument with your own caution, I turned back toward camp. I had the gas sensor cradled and the thermal camera off to spare its battery, and I was rehearsing out loud the sentences I would use with colleagues who hate romance in a field report. The rim answered me, not with words, not with anything that could go into a data table, but with a long, slow exhalation that did not match the timed rhythm I had held in the back of my skull since first light. The plume's hush lengthened into a pause, then resumed on a fractionally new beat. My steps adjusted without permission, the way one does when a companion slows without speaking. The seismometer at the first station, still logging behind me, clicked through its own steady work, and I imagined the line finding a new pattern at the exact moment my stride had changed. I resisted the urge to run back and check. Instruments teach you patience by punishing the opposite. Near the two flags that had traded manners, I stopped again. I dug around their bases with the rock hammer's pick and found nothing but dense ash and a thin grain of ice that should not have had time to grow in air this dry. I pinched a shard between glove and forefinger and felt it resist, not slippery, almost waxy. I set the piece on a patch of pumice and watched it refuse to melt as quickly as it should have. The thermal camera, when I gave in and checked, showed that same patch cooler than its neighbors, a pocket of absence beside a place that had felt warm under the palm. Warmth where it should not walk, cool where heat should bully, smell wrong when read by devices, a beat that lags radio and leads footsteps, a family portrait of something I could not name. I said as much into the recorder and heard the strain in my own voice. Camp called me back with the kind tone people use when they do not wish to say worry. Weather reports from Down Valley had promised a lift that did not come. Fog had decided to stay for a while. I answered with position and a promise to return on the direct line. I tucked the gas strips into their envelope, secured the seismometer cases, and left the last station for the next loop. Because there are lines you do not cross alone when sight is shortened and the rim is practicing a second language. On the way in, I felt the ground answer a step I had not taken yet, and I chose not to test it. There is a point where curiosity becomes trespass. I set my foot down after the anticipated nod anyway, because fear left unchecked grows teeth. Inside the tent, the stove revived the room's temper. I laid the vials in their neat row and wiped condensation from the thermal camera. The drone dried with a faint ticking like cooling tin. I cued the day's clips and let one of the anticipatory nods play out in my earphones, listening to my own breath lift at the exact moment the line twitched. I stared at the canvas and waited for it to answer me the way the caldera had been answering, one beat early, one truth late. Outside, the fog bled the world into one room with no walls. I told the recorder that, per field rules, I would hold the alarm armed but sleeping, and that the next step would be to test the feed for pattern when the fog lifted. I didn't say the last sentence that had entered my mouth and parked behind my teeth, that the ground had begun to behave like a colleague who knows your question before you have asked it and has already prepared an answer you will not like. The fog thinned enough to make shapes honest and then held, so I stayed in the tent with the stove doing quiet work and put the caldera on the table in a line of paper, coils, and screens. I told the recorder I was moving to feed analysis with attention to timing irregularities, anticipatory twitches, and the possibility of crosstalk from other instruments. Routine first, because ritual keeps imagination from dressing up as evidence. I dried the drone's controller by the stove, checked the rock hammer for the small chips that mean I've been hasty, warmed the gas pump under the jacket so its breath wouldn't lie about temperature, and propped the thermal camera against a folded jacket to let its lens shed the remaining damp. Then I opened the seismometer logs and let their thin ink hum through me like a metronome I had forgotten I carried. The baseline was the Earth's patient murmur. Under that, the things we name and file. Distant microquakes, the tiny rattles of frost relaxing, a fox stepping where no fox should step. Above that lived the new guest, the anticipatory nod that had arrived before my heel. I didn't trust my memory to protect the clean edge of observation, so I synced the recorder's muttered field notes to the traces, matching the point where my breath rose to the tremor's polite bow. I found it once, then again, then in places where I had not been conscious of thinking about a step at all, only of tightening a strap or choosing a word. The bow sometimes came not only before movement, but before its decision, as if the ground were finishing my sentences. I told the log, speaking slowly, that correlation extended to preparatory intent and not only to the act, and that I would test for pattern without promising myself anything. Pattern work is dirty in the field because the mind is a machine that can teach itself any song if you hum the first bar long enough. I gave myself rules. I would not count. I would give the trace and the radio reply and the thermal smear equal attention for one sitting, then break for the rim, then return and ask whether I had been seduced by cadence. The radio first. I played the call from camp where the cadence had worn a new jacket and listened for the fold, that small lag that made syllables lean. The delay happened in a place that matched the nod on the trace within a breath, not exact, not neatly superimposed, but friendly in its alignment. Once is weather, twice is habit. I played another clip, this one from the previous loop when fog had pressed close and my voice had held its careful plainness. The fold met the nod again, like acquaintances in a market. I wrote that down and underlined it, then crossed out the underlining because I dislike bullies in my own notes. The drone logs next. The controller wrote down its own heartbeat, a series of small voltages and adjustments that do not care for poetry. In that plain diary was the uncommanded hover drift from the North Arc, a tiny lean and correction as if a tired person nodded and woke. It had occurred when I had been watching the warm smear return one stone away on the thermal feed. I told myself that my attention is not a field that acts on machines, and yet the timing of my attention and the machine's drift had danced together. I added a line to the notes. Correspondence across systems present, map cause later, do not preach now. I stood, stretched my lower back, and let the tent air wash the taste of old wire from behind my teeth. Outside, the fog kept the ridge for itself. I went to the rim, repeating the loop with the kind of care I save for mornings when the place feels like it has moved the furniture. The flags behaved no better or worse than they had, still honest where I had pressed them, and dishonest in the distance they demanded underfoot. The seismometer at the welded ash ledge gave its polite nod before my heel chose, as if practicing a greeting for a person still in the hallway. The gas sensor read clean while my eyes watered a little, and the reactive strip leaned toward a faint stain with the obstinacy of a mule. The thermal camera found the cross-grain warmth again, softer now, and in its path, a small pocket of absence where cooling pretended to be shade with no source. I spoke into the recorder that the smear persisted under similar weather, and that absence presented beside presence along a path that did not respect slope. I did not chase. The fog made sure of that. Back in the tent, I returned to the feed with the kind of patience you owe a friend who speaks softly. I separated the trace into intervals bounded by my own sentences, using the verbal punctuation of field notes as a stand-in for time I refused to number. When I spoke a routine phrase, the nod did not care. When I asked the recorder a question in a voice that belonged to nights near lava tubes and not to dry paperwork, the nod leaned forward. When I said the word step, even as a thought, it sometimes bowed. When I said the word wait and meant it, the line sometimes answered with a contrarian twitch, a small refusal like a child's. I began to suspect that the caldera was not anticipating motion so much as participating in conversation, rude and quiet by turns, using a grammar I was too proud to admit I did not know. That line I did not speak aloud. I wrote instead, test with neutral thoughts versus directed intention. Minimize bias by reading unrelated passages. So I read out loud from the camp manual sentences about shelter maintenance and the order in which to shut down equipment if weather makes liars of predictions. The line lay still. I read a fragment from a pocket notebook about a trip years ago where frost flowers had grown on a tent wall and a colleague had dreamed of the sea. The line offered a nod like a friend. I stopped. I heard myself breathing through my scarf, even though I was not wearing it. I told the recorder in the driest voice I could find that unrelated narrative produced a response while procedural text did not, that the effect was weak but present, and that I would halt this line of testing to avoid teaching myself a result. The stove ticked as if applauding. During this, the radio gave a little cough that was not a call sign. Camp came on with a routine schedule check and asked, in that gentle way people ask the question they already know the answer to, whether I plan to keep the alarm asleep through the afternoon. Orders said arm it only if certain thresholds are met. Field reality said thresholds are blunt tools when the thing you are measuring does not use ordinary doors. I said, as mildly as I could, that I would put the alarm on a leash, armed but muzzled, and that I would stay close to the first station for a while to see whether the nods organize themselves. Camp accepted this and added, like a person tacking a note to a door, that the downstream valley had reported a faint smell like struck matches on a wind that should have come clean off snow. We let the silence sit between us for a breath. Then we blamed a snow machine we had not seen and closed the channel with the promises people make when they do not like the shape of a story. I set the alarm with the volume turned to a whisper only I would hear, a private bell that would not spook the others. I routed the seismometer feed into its throat and watched the light change from dumb green to the gentler hue that means ready. The first station clicked its wheels in the background. I stood, put on the jacket still warm at the shoulders, took the hammer, and stepped out. The fog wrapped the world in felt. The ground at the lip felt like a chest you could rest your hand on to know whether someone is awake. I thought about lifting my foot, and the alarm sighed in the quiet, a near-silent rush like a match blown out fast. I kept the foot down. The bell stilled. I raised the heel again slowly, thinking of nothing at all, and the bell remained calm. I thought the word step and the bell exhaled again, a soft warning, and the trace on the portable screen showed the polite nod. I do not like being handled. The mountain has the right to shake and simmer and sulk. It does not have the right to finish my sentences. I crouched and laid the hammer on the ash as if making an offering and said, between my teeth so the recorder wouldn't think I was speaking to it, that I would take the gift, but I would not be rushed. The plume breathed a little longer, then resumed. The flag stood without comment. The drone case watched me like a shut eye. I kept the alarm on its leash and walked the first arc again, saying the neutral words we use when we do not wish to teach a place our fears. The nods came where they wished, not at every pause, not like a machine, not random either. And sometimes they chose to arrive when I thought of the path across the basin that the warm smear liked to travel. Intention alone provoked a whisper and then nothing, like a friend who half rises from a chair and then sits back down. By late light, I had filled the notebook with sentences I would be ashamed to show a committee and proud to show a colleague who has had a bad night on a turbulent slope. I told the recorder that the feed displayed behavior consistent with a code not yet understood, one that seemed to couple to thought, to language, to attention, and to the rhythm of the crater's own breath. I added, against my own better judgment, that the radio's folded cadence and the drone's sleepy drift had entered the family photo. I ended with the promise to set new stations along the arc where the smear had walked, not down on the floor, not yet, but closer than before, because if conversation is being offered, then we are already in it, whether we answer or not. I returned to the tent with the alarm still whisper-armed and laid the hammer by the door. The stove made its tiny storms. I queued a fresh tape for morning and wrote on the label in plain letters, code on the feed, do not trust the urge to name. Outside, the fog held. Inside, the bell breathed once on its own and fell quiet, and I couldn't tell whether it had heard me think about stepping or had decided we should keep talking even when no one moved. By the time the tent cooled to a working temper, the bell had learned to breathe with me. I kept it leashed, volume faint enough to hide under the stove's soft ticking, and I dressed slow so my thoughts would not hurry the ground. I told the recorder that I would hold the alarm armed through the day, that I would set a small run of temporary ears along the upper arc where the warm smear had walked, and that I would do it without stepping onto the basin floor. Orders prefer caution, shaped like circles. Field reality sometimes needs a thin line thrown forward. I warmed the pump under the jacket, tucked the reactive strips in an easy pocket, checked the hammer's face for new chips, and slipped the thermal camera where I could bring it up without thinking. The drone remained folded and resentful beside the stove, a tool that knew it had been grounded. On the rim, the fog had thinned into a high veil that let the plume show its spine. The flags stood in their corrected postures, yet the ground between two of them still stole a stride from me the way mischief steals a syllable. I went to the welded ash ledge and listened. The trace offered its polite nod before my heel as if happy to resume a conversation. I laid the portable screen on the rock so I could see its small heartbeat and keep my hands free. The bell in my pocket sighed when I thought about stepping, then settled when I gave the thought back to the morning. I spoke into the recorder with the voice of a bored clerk. Anticipatory response present, strength modest, visibility fair, wind light from the bowl. I moved along the rim until I reached the arc above the smear's habitual route. The stone there is young and glassy. It likes to keep secrets. I built the first extra ear from a backpack kit we keep for nights when the map asks for short experiments. The spike refused the first shallow bedding and sang a sour note that told me to try again. I set it deeper into a seam where ash had gathered like a sleeping animal and gave the line a gentle pull. The instrument hummed a plain song. I stepped back, heel raised to test intention, and the nod arrived as before, a friend waiting at a door with a hand already on the knob. I logged coordinates in words and landmarks so I could find the station later with honest feet rather than with arrogance. Then I let the thermal camera drink. The smear showed faint, not a stripe today, more like breath left on glass. It crossed the frame against habit and thinned where absence liked to sit. I lowered the camera to break the charm and reminded myself I was here to hold the alarm steady, not to chase a rumor into the bowl. The gas sensor tried to make peace and failed. I let it drink alone from its little stake, then returned and took it into my hands. The air tasted like matchhead and old wire again with a sweet undertone that did not belong to snow or ash. The pump kept its heartbeat. The line remained the kind that earns funding. I told the recorder that the device held to its honesty while the body insisted on a narrative. I drew a sample into glass, capped it with a motion learned in colder places, and slid it into the pocket where warmth would keep it from lying later. I touched a strip to the breeze and saw the faintest sigh of color, the kind that would be a number under proper light. I called camp on the radio in a neutral tone and reported routine, then added the small quarrel between nose and machine. The reply wore a softer version of the fold, that half-beat lag that makes familiar voices sound like they are remembering a word as they speak it. I asked them to repeat the last phrase. The second time it came straight. I logged repetition of cadence wobble and told myself not to dignify it with a name. I set a second ear along the arc, closer to the notch where the rim funnels breath. The ground there has a quiet drummer's hand, a tapping just under skin. The new instrument settled and began its patient listening. When I raised my heel, it offered a nod, then another tiny tremor, as if adjusting to the idea that we were speaking in earnest. I found myself whispering to it the way one talks to a skittish animal, promising that I would not cross the line. The bell in my pocket gave a soft exhale that matched the whisper, and I realized I had taught myself to measure in size. The thermal camera, when I let it back up, showed a brighter point along the smear's path, not hot, only less shy than the rest. It appeared, stalled, and came again one stone away, as if following a buried stitch. I did not follow it. I marked the stone with a gloved thumb and made a sentence about restraint into the recorder, so I would have to argue later if I broke it. By mid-morning, the veil lifted further and the caldera showed its ribs. I walked the circuit with the bell purring against my leg, holding the leash short so it would not bark at every stray thought. At the two flags that liked to stretch the path, the ground stole from me again. I bent and dug with the hammer's pick, pulling up damp ash and thin crust. Beneath the crust, a seam of ice held a stubborn, waxy feel that belonged to other altitudes. I set a shard on pumice and watched it refuse to melt with the casual speed it should have. The thermal camera later agreed, showing that patch cooler by a hair beside ground that felt warm under a palm. Presence beside absence. Yes, again. I set it without drama into the recorder and kept moving. The drone argued from its case. I let it out on a short leash near the tent to test for that sleepy drift, lifting it no higher than my chest and no farther than a stone's throw. The feed painted the rim as a sketch in damp wool. The craft held position, then eased a finger's width without permission, then returned as if embarrassed. I logged uncommanded lean, trivial magnitude and told myself it was static on cold plastic. The controller hummed faintly against my wrist. A human voice came through the radio and asked whether I had changed alarm status because a quiet tone had bled onto their end of the line. I had not. I moved the receiver away from the seismometer case and the tone faded. The mountain does not worry about our etiquette. Signals pass through one another like neighbors in a small town. I gave the feed another session because the day demanded it. I separated the trace into those intervals bracketed by my voice again, then into stretches when I had said nothing at all. The nod came most often in the breaths where I thought of moving, of course, but also in moments when I read passage out loud from a pocket notebook about places with their own rules. It ignored procedural text. It leaned toward sentences with human heat in them. I tried to trick it by whispering nonsense, but even nonsense carries intention. The line answered. When I emptied my head and stared at the tent seam until the stitches blurred, the nod went shy and small. The bell breathed on its own, once with no change on the trace, a soft rush like a child in another room blowing out a candle. I logged that inconsistency and told myself to distrust my ears. Moral pressure arrived with the afternoon call. Camp reminded me of the threshold rules with the kindness of people who know you will ignore them and want you to feel less alone when you do. They asked whether I planned to put a foot on the basin floor to settle the warm smears story. I said no, not yet. Not without a partner. Not without the weather doing something braver than this. The silence that followed was all the permission I needed and none that I could use. I promised to hold the line at the rim and to keep the alarm gentle. After the call, the plume exhaled longer than it had all morning, and my stride adjusted without asking me. At last light the smear brightened in the thermal like a thought surfacing. The cross-grain path came clear, moving in stops the way a cautious animal checks a doorway. At each stop, the seismometer at the nearest temporary ear offered a nod not just before my heel, but before the smear shifted, as if the ground were finishing two sentences at once. I felt the urge to step down and intersect the path just once to steal a sample from the air above it, and felt the bell draw breath in my pocket, ready to sigh. I held still and said a sentence to the recorder that tasted like a bridle. Hold the alarm. Do not teach your body to chase the thing that wants to be chased. The plume hushed and resumed on a new beat, and for a breath, I thought I heard it answer in kind. I took the long way back to camp to bleed the urge from my muscles. The flags watched me with a patience that felt like advice. The ash held the marks of my boots in patterns I didn't like, prints that seemed to pause a few paces behind where I knew I had stopped, as if some part of me had lingered or some other had walked in my rhythm and delayed. I crouched and touched one of the lagging prints. The ground under it trembled in a shy way that didn't travel to the others. I told the recorder that traces of my passage displayed misalignment with memory, that a private echo might be at work, and that I would not use that phrase in a report if I wanted to be invited back. Inside, the stove made weather of its own. I laid the vials in their line, labeled the new ears in the log with words instead of numbers, and set the bell on the table, leash attached, so it would not startle me if it decided to breathe uninvited. I wrote the field note that disgusts and comforts in equal measure. The feed answered intention across devices. The gas sensor refused the story my mouth told. The thermal path offered presence paired with near absence. The flags kept honest posture while space between them stretched. The radio wore a fold that corrected on a second ask. The drone drifted like a tired head. I wrote one more sentence I knew I would regret. The ground and I shared a thought before either of us moved. The bell exhaled as my pencil reached the end of that line. I froze, then laughed once without humor because the trace on the screen stayed calm. When the breath left my chest, the seismometer nodded, polite as ever, and the plume added a longer hush for a heartbeat and a half. I told the recorder that I would sleep in short slices with the alarm leashed and the hammer by the door, and that at dawn I would decide whether to place a foot on the floor in daylight with a safety line in sight. I didn't write the last thought, the one that waited like a hand on a latch, that the conversation had stopped pretending to be one-sided. Dawn arrived with a thin, sharpened light that pretended to be clarity. I laid out the descent kit anyway. Harness uncoiled, belay loop checked by touch rather than sight, anchor webbing rolled flat so it would not twist under load, a small rack of slings that smelled faintly of dust and salt from past seasons, and the safety line flaked into a loose, obedient pile. I spoke the checklist in a voice carved down to its bones. Helmet cinch, knot memory, stakes for a top anchor and welded ash, hammer for persuasion, not for force. Seismometer on a short lead so I could see the nod without having to crouch. Gas sensor warmed under the jacket until its pump sighed like a cat. Thermal camera inside my shell so its lens would not carry fog. Drone grounded unless the air asked for a higher eye. I told the recorder that I would throw a thin line into the bowl without setting foot on the floor, that I would haul back whatever the air offered, and that if the ground tried to finish my sentences, I would leave before it reached the period. The rim felt narrower than yesterday, as if the place had spent the night nibbling from both sides. Flags stood in their corrected postures, but the stretch between the two troublemakers had grown again into that subtle, thieving longness. I placed the top anchor where the welded ash ledge thicks up, the same bedrock that has forgiven many experiments. The first stake bit grudgingly, the sound of metal singing a note I do not like, too high, too polite. I backed it out, moved half a stride down to a seam that felt older, and drove it until the wrist reported that satisfying stop. The backup anchor below it accepted the sling as if glad for company. I set the master point, felt it with closed eyes to judge the lay, and clipped the safety line with a stopper knot I could tie in my sleep. The seismometer sat beside my knee on its plate, and its trace offered that now familiar bow when the thought of weighting the line crossed my mind. I told it we were not there yet, and the bell in my pocket sighed and settled. I fed the safety line across air toward the faint bench where the warm smear liked to pause and think. The rope took the bend without complaint, and I cast a small messenger weight to carry a sampling strip into that pocket. The wind held steady, a very light favor. I let the strip hang in the breath of the bowl and counted in words until boredom sanded my thoughts clean. On the portable screen, the trace answered me not with a single bow, but with a small progression, like a person rising from a chair a little at a time. I kept my hands still. Hands. The gas sensor in my chest pocket began to purr without gaining drama on its indicator. My tongue found the taste of struck match braided with warm tin in a cloy I could not place. I brought the line home, sealed the strip in glass, and told the recorder that the field would call the color equivocal and the mouth would call it a message. I whispered to the harness out of old habit and stepped into it. The buckles lay where they should, the webbing snug against hips and thighs, fabric that knows both fall and restraint. I clipped into the master point and took a short load on the line to let the anchor speak. The rock answered with the dull kindness of something used to work. The seismometer bowed before I shifted, the bell breathed, and the plume lengthened its hush as if passing a hand over its mouth to hide a smile. I decided then that descent would be denied unless the day gave me a cleaner permission than this meddling chorus. I told the recorder that the body wanted the floor and the place wanted a conversation, and that both wants were suspect. I sat back against the line anyway to test friction and retrieve the next sampling strip toward the smear's usual route. The rope moved smoothly and then, for a heartbeat, felt waxed under glove, slick without being wet. I gripped, found purchase, and the sensation left as if it had been only my mind shying from the drop. I swapped tools and gave the thermal camera its turn. The bowl floor glowed as a quilt of old warmth and new cool in the moody palette I have learned to read. The cross-grained path brightened in the veiled light and stalled beside the spot where yesterday a pocket of absence had sat like a reprimand. Today, the absence was smaller, tighter, as if it had learned to curl itself. The smear crossed it and dimmed, then regained its strength 2 stones away. I held the frame until the weight of the camera made my forearms burn so I would not accuse fatigue of inventing. The path's stops lined with the moment when the seismometer offered its polite bows to the idea of my foot moving. I said that sentence into the recorder and heard how foolish and true it sounded at once. The radio called me by name and asked if I had stepped over the lip because their board showed a whisper on the channel that did not belong to any human call. I had not. I moved the receiver farther from the instrument case and the whisper eased. The voice from camp wore the same small fold as before, a near lag that makes words feel like they have to swim through a membrane. I asked for the phrase again and received it clean. They added, almost as an afterthought, that a station down valley had reported a smell like spent matches in air that should have blown glacier clean. I wrote that down because other noses are useful even when your instrument hates being told it is wrong. I gave the gas question its theater and its trial. I pinned the intake at chest height in the rim breeze, backed away, and let it drink without the warmth of my hands. Then I returned and held it low over ash, then near the harness buckle, then out over the bowl with my arm threaded through the belay so I would not teach myself permanent lessons. The pump kept calm. The line stayed gentle. My eyes watered a little. The reactive strip leaned again toward a quiet color. I told the recorder that body and paper still argued, that the instrument kept its virtue, and that any report I write will have to explain why the field keeps telling the same story with different voices. I put the cap on the vial the way my first mentor taught me, with certainty, as if certainty could be borrowed and saved for lean days. The drone came out because I wanted a view slightly lower than the rim without the sin of footsteps. I lifted it to a prudent height and sent it along the arc, skimming the inside edge where the smear had stitched its way. The feed painted the bowl in damp wool again, and the overlay grid flickered, then rebuilt with a crosshair shift no thicker than a glove seam. The craft drifted a finger's width without request, then corrected itself, as if embarrassed. The controller hummed against my wrist like a polite hand cleared of crumbs. I logged uncommanded lean, trivial repeat of prior behavior, and brought the craft home. As it descended, it gave a thin rise in tone, the exact sound the bell in my pocket makes when I think the word step. I set it on its case and told it, as if to a junior partner, that it was done for the morning. I turned back to the anchor to break it down and felt the rim go tight around me, not narrower in space, but narrower in choices. The ground answered a step I had not taken. The bell gave its soft rush. The seismometer bowed twice in quick succession even as I stood still. I set a palm on the rock to remind it of our agreement and felt a tremor so shy it could have been my pulse, except it ran cross-grained to my heartbeat and wore a rhythm I recognized from the plume's new timing. The breath below lengthened again, then clipped short. A second later, the radio gave a cough as if someone had covered the microphone with a hand. The flags did not move. The space between them lengthened anyway. I told the recorder that the place had offered a narrowing, that descent would not be attempted, and that I would pull back to camp and consider whether to relocate a pair of ears to the shoulder above the down valley path. I packed slow and deliberate, that old mountain courtesy you extend to a room that has decided to change while you are still sitting in it. The anchor came clean, the line flaked back into its pile with no twist. The gas vials went into their row like small refusals. The thermal camera slept in its pouch. The hammer rode the pack where its weight could tell me that I was still carrying a rule. On the way past the two difficult flags, I knelt to smooth the ash around my prints and saw that the marks trailed me by a half stride again, as if another version of me had walked my route and refused to catch up. I pressed a glove into the ash beside the lagging print and felt the ground stiffen under the heel of my hand and relax under the fingers, a strange split in a single palm's breadth. I stood, told the recorder I would not pursue that feeling, and turned my back on the bowl. Inside the tent, the stove made a little climate that tried to untie the morning. I set the bell on the table, still leashed, and let the seismometer feed run to paper while I brewed water to a quiet boil. I said into the recorder that descent was denied by conditions not visible to any rulebook we respect, that the conversation had moved from curiosity to negotiation, and that I would widen the ear line along the rim toward the shoulder where the valley wind reports its stories. I put down the microphone and reached for the first vial to label it with a plain name. The bell exhaled, not an answer to my hand or my thought, but an answer to a word I had not said yet. Somewhere in the coil of cables, the portable screen drew a small bow before my breath, and outside the tent, the plume chose a longer hush that stepped out of the rhythm I had learned, and then did not step back. The radio clicked once without speaking. My pencil hovered over the glass. I realized that the mountain had taken the next part of the conversation away from me, and that all I had left was whether to listen or to pretend. I wrote nothing at all and let the silence stand between us like a new tool laid on the table. Silence is a tool if you let it work. I let it sit between the bell and me until the stove's tiny weather steadied the room. Then I spoke into the recorder in the driest tone I could find. The place had taken the lead. I would move ears toward the shoulder above the down valley path, keep the alarm leashed, and carry out a relocation with care that bordered on superstition. I laid the vials in their line, labeled none of them, and put the rock hammer by the door with its face turned inward like a guest who knows when to stop talking. The gas sensor warmed in my jacket. The pump gave its quiet purr. The thermal camera leaned against the pack like a sleeper. The drone sat folded with the patience of a closed eye. I told myself to work, not to think. Outside, the rim had shed its veil. The plume climbed in a thinner stripe, breath more deliberate than it had been. The flag stood honest in posture and dishonest in the distance they demanded of my legs. I knelt at the welded ash ledge and let the seismometer wake. Comfort noise rose like low rain on tin. I waited without moving while my mind rehearsed a step, and the line bowed its polite bow before my heel. I said nothing to it. I would not feed the habit. I lifted the case and moved along the arc until the view opened toward the shoulder, where valley wind tells its stories. There I planted a new ear with slow care, spike-tested, line-seated, shallow trench smoothed over so boot and cable would not learn bad manners. The instrument took its place and listened. The gas question came with me like a stubborn tune. The air tasted like a match that had given up and a wire that did not wish to be exposed, with a thin, sweet edge that belonged to rooms where batteries nap. The instrument drank and wrote its clean humility across a face people trust because it never changes tone. I pulled a strip from the envelope and held it high, then low, then at the rim line. A faint stain came like a rumor you wish were stronger so you could stop doubting it. I said into the recorder that body and paper continued to disagree, that strip color leaned without drama, that I would send the vials downhill if weather permitted. The radio coughed and Camp called me by name with a cadence that lagged and then corrected, like a sentence climbing over a low wall. They reported a fresh note from the station below, a smell of spent matches and warm metal in air that should have been washed clean. I thanked them and felt the fold in their words press lightly on mine. I brought the thermal camera to my eye and let it learn. The basin wore its patchwork of cooling and old heat, a quilt stitched without haste. The cross-grained smear returned, not a stripe, not a creature, only a path that did not respect slope or wind. It drifted, paused, dimmed, reappeared one stone away as if borrowed from a trail underneath. Today it had learned to curve, a patient arc angling toward the shoulder rather than down the drain. I marked that in my head like a surveyor trying to pretend he was not trespassing. The smear paused beside a patch that borrowed cold from nowhere, an absence pulled tight like a coin under cloth, then resumed with a patience that felt like patience only because I feared calling it anything else. I widened the ear line in short, careful hops, each placement a sentence in a passage I did not wish to write but could not leave blank. The ground under glove carried that shy underskin tremor again, a pulse you would mistake for your own if you needed to. The seismometer at the welded ash station nodded before I thought of stepping. The new instruments took the hint, bowing small and then smoothing like competent staff when a superior enters the room. I let the bell breathe once in my pocket to remind myself that I could hush it. It obeyed. The plume held a longer hush and then clipped short in a way that made my stride change without permission. I stopped and watched my tendency to obey. When the alarm must be tested, I tested aloud. I set the portable screen where I could see it without bending, routed a thin feed to the bell, and spoke a neutral line into the recorder. The trace lay flat. I thought the word step without meaning it. The bell sighed, soft as a match blown out fast, and the line bowed. I said the word wait and meant it. Nothing moved. I read a passage from the camp manual about stove safety. Nothing cared. I read aloud a note about a colleague who once watched frost flowers grow on a tent wall and swore they were listening. The bell breathed on its own, and the line gave a shy tilt, as if pleased to be remembered. I shut my mouth. I turned the bell low enough to make it mine again. The drone argued again from the case. I told it to hold. It did not hold with grace. As I clipped the case shut, a thin rise in tone came from its motors, uninvited, and died as if embarrassed. I logged the misbehavior, trivial, repeat. The controller hummed a ghost of static against my wrist. The radio added a whisper that belonged to no human voice, then stopped when I moved it farther from the instrument plate. Fields passing through fields, neighbors in a small town. By midday light, I had the ear line pushed toward the shoulder, a string of listening cups set where valley wind could bring a story without asking me to step where I had sworn not to. I took a breath and tasted nothing at all for half a dozen heartbeats. The air went blank. In that gap, the seismometer at the far end bowed 2 quick bows without invitation. The plume's rhythm shifted a hair to a beat I would not have chosen. I called camp with a voice of plain facts and asked for confirmation that their board was clean. They answered in that near lag and told me the downstream station had gone to a busy tone that did not belong on our band. We blamed solar mood we could not measure and moved on with the politeness of people who understand what it would cost to say the other thing. Moral pressure finally put its hand on my shoulder. The smear, measured only in shades, not in courage, had arced toward the shoulder and toward me. The ground had learned to answer my thoughts and to finish my sentences with small bows. The radio had developed a fold that corrected when asked. The gas sensor refused to share the story that cheeks and eyes told. The flags kept posture but stretched space like taffy. Every sign said, "Stay on the rim, add ears, make patience your professional skill." Every part of me older than training wanted a sample from the air where the smear had chosen to pause near the shoulder. I compromised the way professionals do when they wish to pretend they did not. I tied a short length to the top anchor, clipped the belay to my harness, and leaned enough to float the sampling strip into that corridor of warmth without crossing the line that makes a rule into a dare. The strip darkened faster than before, not dramatic, not showy, only honest. I sealed it without looking twice and began to reel in the line. The rope slid through my glove with a feel like wax again, and then chose to be ordinary. As the strip came up, the seismometer at my knee bowed before my heel had even considered moving, then bowed again in a pattern that was not mine. The bell breathed a short phrase that sounded like a word cut in half. On the portable screen, small nods arranged themselves with a spacing that looked for all the world like an attempt at cadence. I heard in my head the simple field word we use when we are ready to leave a place tidy. The nods matched that rhythm as if they had been listening to my thoughts for days and had at last found a way to speak back. I did not answer. I pulled the line hand over hand until the strip came into my reach and then stopped for no reason I could defend. The air above the shoulder carried the faintest smell of struck match and the thin sweet of warmed wire. The plume held its breath. The flags didn't move, and their shadows leaned in the wrong direction by the width of a boot sole. The radio clicked without voice. I stepped back from the line, and the ground bowed once more with a confidence it had not shown before. Not a nod now, but a small wave, the kind of ripple that travels along a rope when someone at the far end decides to show you they are there. I packed in the practiced order of retreat. Ears left powered where their batteries could carry them, cables bedded, lid sealed, notebook shut on a sentence I refused to read. The drone stayed on the table. The gas vials found their row. The thermal camera slept. The hammer went to its place by the door. I told the recorder in a voice broken down to truth that the feed had found a pattern that answered cadence rather than force, that a message might be forming, and that any attempt to name it would be a sin I would not forgive myself. I said I would hold the alarm armed, that I would not step below the rim, that I would wait for a partner and for weather that speaks plain. I reached for the tent flap to mark the end of work. The bell exhaled a full breath and held it. The seismometer's line rose into a tidy phrase I could almost read if I let myself. The plume drew out a hush longer than any I had counted in my head since arriving. The radio opened without a call sign and let a voice through that, wore my tone and my breath, and said, in the careful field voice I use when I wish not to be accused of romance, that I should not put my foot down until I had read the next line. Outside on the thermal screen I had forgotten to power off, the cross-grained smear had curved the last of its patient arc and had come level with the tent. I held the flap and did not blink. The bell did not breathe again. The line waited with its phrase half-built, polite as ever, ready to finish my sentence if I let it.